All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, friends. Welcome back to On This Hill, our podcast here at Church on the Hill. Pastor Bruce and I sitting down again, have a conversation.
Thanksgiving week.
It is, yeah. This will come out on Thanksgiving week. So
Yeah.
I hope everyone has maybe
a plan.
fasted a couple days so you could feast a couple days.
Yeah,
Is that how that works?
I think so. It's the universal, or it's the National Day of Eating and giving thanks. Hopefully.
It is.
So.
And your family, you're a little, what we'd call in the South, highfalutin. You're not going to just have a turkey, I bet. Something tells me you're not just going to sit down to turkey and stuffing and potatoes. You're going to do something
Actually,
fancy,
not too bad. I mean, none of us really like turkey that much.
Yeah.
That's
un-American,
it's
but sure.
Funny. Yeah.
I love
do-
America myself, but go ahead. Tell me what you like. Yeah. Yeah.
We'll have potatoes, mashed potatoes,
Okay.
and we'll do stuffing. But my son actually does some of the cooking, and he doesn't do anything halfway. So he'll do this exotic stuff, and we usually do some kind of a roast or something, or
That's David,
some
right?
beef. Yeah,
David's a good
they're
cook.
very good at it. So
Yeah.
and I love it because hey, we've been cooking for you guys for years, so now it's your turn to cook for us. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm going to my mom's house, but I think we're going to be doing most of the cooking. We'll see. It's kind of speaking of that, actually, David's a super talented guy. I knew him in the past. I haven't got to be around him
He
very
is
much
super
because I
creative.
lived up in Portland. But there is just this bent to him that is very creative. Like you say, even if it's going to be a meal, it's going to be not Hungry Man dinner.
Right.
It can be something a little bit special, and we're all kind of created a little different that way, with different gifts. You know, some of us are turkey people like me.
Yeah.
But others have a little bit more flair.
Conservative taste versus a little bit more.
Yeah.
What's the word? Taking the chance. Or
Yeah.
A little bit out of the ordinary.
Yeah. But also there's, besides just the individual way that God has made each one of us, there's generational likenesses, right? Mm-hmm. So within your generation, there's going to be a lot of diversity.
Right.
But you'll all have certain things in common. Like anyone born within this, spot that we call a generation will have lived through certain formative things.
Right.
And that is sort of, changes them and molds a generation. I was wondering if we could maybe talk just a little bit about that today.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you look around and every generation is shaped by, first of all, I think there's historical context, whatever's going on in history around the world or in the nation. So I'm a baby boomer. So the baby boomers are, I think, 1948 to 59 or 1960. Yeah. So
raised by a World War II generation.
Right. That was my family.
So that's a pretty big distinctive thing to have a generation who had made great sacrifices and confronted really global evil. I don't know what else to call it.
Right.
Evil.
Yeah. It was a world war. I mean, it was a very real world war. And not only that, but that's maybe the downside, but that did something in my father's generation, that they came into parenting out of a war and out of a season of self-denial, a season of sacrifice.
Right.
So when they got back home, they just wanted to live peaceably, to build homes, to raise families, and to contribute to the culture, the country that they'd saved, right?
Yeah.
Which is a very valid thing. It was a very real threat. And that produced this incredible wave of advancement, prosperity, not just in the economy, but I think in the sciences. 1969 was the lunar landing, and there's all kinds. The 60s was super tumultuous at the same time, and so that every generation, I think, has this cultural context, historical context.
So if we walk through the generations just a little bit one at a time, and is there a sense that your generation had a certain assignment, like a calling? Because I'd say the assignment of is there another name for them besides? I've always heard them called the greatest generation.
Well, I think that would be my father's generation.
Yeah, your father's generation.
The greatest generation.
So their assignment was, we got to win a world war.
Yeah.
We've got to, stop and defeat this tyranny, and there was a big assignment there for them.
It's interesting that assignment. The reason I think they call that the greatest generation, I think it was it Brokaw that wrote the book by that very
Tom
name.
Brokaw,
He looked at a generation of 20-somethings. Basically, my dad was in his early 20s when he joined the war effort. He didn't get drafted. He enlisted with his two brothers.
Some of them are teenagers.
Yeah, and they are in combat. regardless of what we think about that. Now they're
Sure.
getting up in the morning and going into combat, not knowing if they're going home, ever going to come back. You just think about the mindset that must have created in them of a sense of sacrifice, courage, but also of like risk, risk taking and
Right.
things like that. So yeah, I mean, they feel like, hey, if we did that, we can do anything.
Yeah.
We can accomplish anything.
And then your generation that came from that, I kind of think of them as builders.
Right.
They really built.
Yeah.
Because there was like you say, a sense of self-sacrifice had to be made.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't a lot to go towards anything but the war effort
Yeah.
for a generation. And there was, also a depression that had come before that.
Right.
So I think there was a long season of, there's not a lot around here, a lot of the scarcity, basically.
Yeah.
But then after the war, there was a boom, not just of babies, but of finances.
Yeah, so much money and so much energy and even human life was dedicated to the war effort. And I think once we hit the late 40s, 50s, I mean, there was this huge sort of national rising up of let's rise and build and innovation. All kinds of amazing innovation happened in that season. Creativity. You look at the music scene of the early 60s, mid 60s, incredible creativity, innovation, economics in every area. I mean, science, every area was booming, basically. I think that's where the name came from.
So is that maybe part of not that we can identify, neither one of us are historians, but maybe that's part of the assignment of that generation, of your generation, was that building, maintaining and building and passing on a certain,
with one eye on the world, right? Because even though we were in the late 50s, 60s building, the world was still a mess. I mean, post-war Europe was a mess, and then of course you had Korean conflicts, and then later in the 60s, Vietnam coming up, and so it's like this constant sort of a turmoil and uncertainty. I think every generation has to deal with.
Yeah, think about how the church changed too from those two generations. Yeah. So in that generation of World War II, there was a pretty strong Christian culture within the U.S., and I think war often turns people to God too, because they see good and evil, and they realize we need God. But then that baby boomer generation, there was a sexual revolution. There was a kind of a rebellion against status quo and institutions, but also a Jesus revolution
at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. If you've seen the movie, The Jesus Revolution, which was supposedly depicting that Jesus movement in California in the 1960s, I mean, it was absolutely true. I mean, historically, you can even go back from secular statistics and see how thousands and thousands of young people in the late 60s were swept into the church. But again, at the same time, there's this cultural revolution, the sexual revolution, drugs, the rise of violence, racism, all kinds of tensions. So it's funny how every generation it's almost like life is moving on two tracks. There's what is God doing, and then what is culture doing. And I think if you look at it from a Christian worldview, I think God is answering every we live in this broken world, this fallen world, and so the warfare of that world, the spiritual warfare I'm talking about now, never stops, never ceases. The devil, the thief, comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy, whether it's individuals or families or generations. And so it's almost like God has an answer in every generation.
Yeah,
if we'll look for it.
Yeah, there's a redemption. There's the gospel lands on every generation, but the questions that the generation is asking aren't necessarily the same.
No.
So the greatest generation, they had a certain set of questions, and your generation had a different set of questions. Yeah. But the gospel answered both of those sets of questions, if asked. If they will ask the gospel, it does have those answers. Then my generation, we're Gen X, so born in the mid-60s to late 70s, come of age then in the 70s and 80s, which is a time of real excess.
Yeah.
A time of
Wall Street.
Yeah, Wall Street. Yeah. There was. Yeah, you could even see it in the in the fashion and the culture, bright colors, garish, neon. Right. Miami Vice would be a great example if you want to
the drug trade. And
if you want to see what did we think about what did we idolize? Watch Miami Vice would be a great example of this is what we thought was cool, what we thought was big, where we wanted to go. True. And really very materialistic, I'd say. There was no more self-sacrifice, wasn't a thing that was talked about a lot. Not that nobody talked about it, but generationally, I think there was a lot more, this unbounded optimism, only tempered by Reagan era and Soviet communist tension.
The Cold War.
So much of our entertainment was around the idea of a World War III, an imminent World War III, nuclear holocaust, post-apocalyptic, a whole lot of talk about that in my generation. I remember growing up thinking, I probably won't live to be that old because there'll be a world war. There'll be because the next war is going to be fought with nuclear weapons, and there's no winner.
No winners, yeah.
Yeah, there's no winners.
I think it's interesting, though, that just what you're saying there, I think the 60s had this huge, and I wasn't super old in the 60s. I was still in grade school, middle school. But the 60s had this, on one hand, there was this optimism, if you will, of, hey, the advances of science and mankind's getting better. But at the same time, there was this counterweight of just endless conflict. The Cold War, like I said, or Korea or something like that. And so there was this huge rise of, they called World War I the war to end all wars.
Right.
And then it wasn't just a few decades later. We're in World War II.
Actually, you haven't seen nothing yet. Watch this.
Yeah. And it's crazy how, the Enlightenment and so forth gave the natural man all this optimism of we're going to get better. We're going to educate ourselves, or logic and reason is going to take us to a new plane of living where there'll be peace and science will solve all our problems. Yeah. But I think the 60s, that all came crashing down.
There's a difference between the modern worldview and the postmodern worldview. The modern worldview thought, we're going to figure this all out. We've got the answers. And the postmodern worldview said, actually, we don't have the answers. We've got technology, but it's not actually meeting the needs.
And even that was suspect or thought to be, very, very suspicious. But so this pessimism, on one hand, breeded this revolutionary kind of thing. Yeah. The marching in the streets, the burning cities down, the protests. Whether it was Vietnam or race or whatever the issue was, huge amount of protests. But on the other hand, there was also, I think, a huge rise in just this nihilistic kind of abandonment, like we're just all doomed. And so into that vacuum, into both those vacuums comes the gospel. The gospel is the only message that brings hope. I think people were, again, I would hope that politics are figured out or government would figure it out or we would figure it out. But we're realizing, man, no one's figuring this out. That's a pretty bleak landscape.
Yeah. And then that where we're at right now, like in the era that we're living in, obviously most of your previous generation, your fathers have passed away.
Yeah, there's not many around.
Yeah. And a lot of your generation are in a place of transition or change. You're on the young side, I think, of boomers.
Maybe,
and my generation, Gen X, we're in this bridge place where, we're starting to take care of our parents. That's a big change for a lot of us, where they took care of us. Now we're starting to take care of our parents. But we've still got kids to take care of. So with this bridge in between, like we've got
both directions.
Young ones. Some of us still have very young ones. Children. Mine are just now grown and into adulthood. But you're not done parenting them because they're in their 20s or in their 30s for that matter. So we're kind of in this bridge place, and then our kids, the younger or the in between. There's the millennials as well.
Yeah.
And maybe I go back for just a second to Gen X. I'm trying to think what our assignment is or has been. And I'm trying to I'm the last generation, I think, that was able to in the West come of age without that much technology.
Right. Yeah.
Pretty much the high technology of the day that affected the home would have been a TV. But we were landing on the moon. We were using space shuttles. We were doing all kinds of other things. But in the home, there wasn't
at the grassroots level.
Yeah, there wasn't a revolution of how we did things. Although our moms were starting to work, and that hadn't happened before.
Yeah,
that's why they called my generation also latchkey kids.
Yeah,
it's the first time.
You let yourself in.
No, there's a lot of I think your mom even worked.
Right.
But it was a lot, traditional families only had one working income. Yeah. But my generation, there started to be two working incomes. But now I think we have this assignment of this bridge and trying to reach between the generations.
Yeah. And I think the generations unfold, whether we like it or not. They're marked by their DNA, but they're marked by social forces and political forces and stuff. But every generation, I think, has these incredible opportunities, but every generation also sees the lack, sees the faults. And tries to make it better
Yeah.
from a optimistic point of view. Let's
Yeah.
let's be better than our last. Every generation seems to throw rocks at the last one.
Yeah.
But the fact is, we weren't living back then, so we don't really understand what it was like.
Well, as a Gen X who's a product of boomer parents, I would say it seemed to me like my parents and many of my contemporaries' parents were doing the best they could to reverse some bad parenting that they'd received.
Possibly, yeah.
I think my mom and dad were consciously trying to do better, which I think every mom and dad does. But I think they kind of had an awareness of, there was just an old traditional way to raise kids, and maybe we're not doing that quite right. Dr. Spock was a big thing at the time, but that was in competition with Dr. Dobson in a way, who, if you know who James Dobson is, Focus on the Family, kind of these two competing ways of how to raise kids.
Right, yeah.
And parents were sort of torn between, like, what does this mean? How do you raise a kid this way? And
It's interesting how they're both those, maybe two different perspectives are on the spectrum, are trying to address a really worthy question of how do we raise our children in a way that's healthy, that's healthy for them, healthy for us, but also healthy for our society and for our culture.
Yeah, and then my generation, we didn't get the internet technologies until we were already of age, but young enough to adopt it. Like, we were not native to the internet,
right,
but we were young. We were teens and 20s, and so we could figure it out, and we did. Actually, a lot of Gen X is in the tech industry, and they're at the forefront of the tech industry, and they know how to do the back end, the underneath stuff.
Yeah, they jumped on that train early.
Yeah, they know how to program. They know this isn't me, but a lot of them did from my generation. And millennials just grew up in it. There was no adopting it. They're native.
They were native. It's interesting. An interesting story about that. We were missionaries in the 90s for the entire decade. We were outside this country in a developing country where there was no internet. There was no technology. Now, in 1988, 87, 88, 89, the first computers, remember?
Oh, yeah.
The 286 computer?
Yeah.
And then if you were really...
I had one.
386 if you had a little more money, and if you were really...
Yep.
A mover and shaker, you had a 486. That's just how they were rated. It was
and they were saying this is the biggest computer you'll ever need. You'll never need more than this.
And now that computer, is
our phones
our phones are 100 times more powerful. But it's funny, as I was here in this country in 86, 87, 88 and watched the computer world or the technology world start to dawn, and then we moved to a country that was back probably 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, when we lived in southern Mexico in the early 90s, there weren't even fax machines. There wasn't even the technology of a fax machine.
Yeah.
I mean, there were no cell phones, there were no ATMs, there was nothing like that.
Right.
Everything, I remember going into banks and they were still using abacuses and those adding machines.
Yeah.
But then what happened was, fascinating thing is 1995. So I would come back here, and like a year later or 2 years later, and technology had taken these giant steps forward. Computers were faster, monitors were full color or whatever, right? And then I would go back home. Well, in 1995 or 94, 95 was NAFTA, the free trade agreement.
Yeah.
And part of that free trade agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico was the opening up of import without huge tariffs. Well, and that's what had kept technology out of Mexico. So in the city I lived in, which is about 150,000 people at that time, they went from having no internet to leapfrogging. Here we had internet, but it was dial-up. If those of you who are older remember using dial-up internet, it made this funny noise. And your modem would connect to a phone line and blah, blah, blah. Well, in Mexico, they never touched dial-up. They went from no internet to high-speed fiber optics because of the NAFTA permission and all this kind of networking, AT&T, MCI, those. And it was wild to watch an entire generation, I remember this so vividly, who had little or no contact with the outside world. The only outside world was if they were tourists or if they read a newspaper, which very few people did. I mean, a small percentage of people would read a newspaper. So everything in their world was around them. And all of a sudden, some kid in a village somewhere would have access to what 16-year-olds are doing all over the world.
Oh, man.
And it was absolutely astounding to watch how quickly the culture there changed in not just technology, but in fashion, in the media, in music, because they were exposed to all these things that they'd been. And on one hand, you could look at that and say, man, what a beautiful thing. On the other hand, I'm not so sure, because Yeah.
It did interesting things to missions for sure, because
Absolutely.
my generation, they also would sometimes call the MTV generation, and MTV kind of everyone started listening to and seeing the same thing and dressing the same way,
Yeah.
and it was relatively global. If you could get
Global
TV,
consumerism.
you can get it. But then with the internet, I remember the first time I went to India, it was around the time when boy bands were a big deal.
Yeah.
And these kids in a little village were saying, who's your favorite boy band? Is it this band or this band? And I'm like, how do you guys, like, I'm looking around and I'm looking at the village. You've got a dirt floor.
Right.
How are you talking to me
a
about the
satellite dish.
Backstreet Boys? How do you know who the Backstreet Boys are?
Yeah.
But it also, in missions, it said, oh, we don't actually speak the same language, but we're kind of starting to share the same culture, pop culture.
Right.
Deeply underneath that, religion and everything else was vastly different. But we had this connection to the pop culture. It was interesting.
Yeah, it was, and I think it accelerated so quickly. I think before 1960. I mean, life was accelerating, but not like you saw once technology hit, because you had this instant global connection where every idea was right in front of you, and every fad and every movement and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Both good and bad. I think there was positive and negative to it. The sharing of information is powerful stuff.
Okay, so millennials are of age in the workforce. That's where they're at right now. They're marrieds.
Yeah.
A lot of them getting married, having kids. We're seeing a wave of millennial children within our church, right? I think most of the kids that are in our kids ministries are starting to come from millennials, especially the nursery. If you go to the nursery, stand at the door long enough, a millennial is going to come by and pick up a kid.
Right.
You get a few grandparents,
Yeah,
but
it's the
mostly it's going to
30-somethings
be
that are
the
dropping off the
millennials.
babies.
And so I think they're starting to. It's interesting watching them starting to rethink everything, because that's what happens when you get married and have a kid. You start to rethink a lot of your choices, a lot of everything else. And they're in an interesting place, but they're also, so not just in the workforce, but within ministry, that's where we start to see, I think, innovation is young millennials with a call in their life.
Yeah.
And maybe they want to see something corrected that needs corrected in the church, or they want to pioneer something that hasn't been done before within the church.
I think that's the beautiful, really redemptive piece of the millennial generation. Every generation has its challenges, every generation has its sin issues, and every generation has its redemptive, where God redeems that, their purposes and their drive and so forth, and their gifts. And I think the millennials, one of the beautiful things is they have this, they've watched their forefathers, and they're like, okay, well, maybe I'm speaking generally, but we don't want to totally throw that all away, but we want to do it better.
Right.
So we want to care for the broken. We want injustice. We want justice issues to be addressed. We want to care for the planet. All those are great things.
Yeah.
And no one quite gets it all right. But I think they are maturing in a way, like you said, having children has caused them to kind of rise up and think through what kind of world do I want my kids to be raised in?
This
is a great question.
Is it too controversial here to talk about? Are there any things that the millennials have pushed the leadership of the church to address that we've slowed them down on purposefully? We said, I don't know if I'm making myself clear. Are there things that millennials say, hey, we really need to say something about global warming from the pulpit? This needs to be talked about. Or, we need to say something about racial inequality or privilege, or that you felt like you don't know enough yet for us to talk about this, or you're driven from an agenda that's not biblical, or... maybe I'm stepping on a third rail, and we shouldn't be talking about this.
It is funny. It's interesting. I was just listening to you, and I was thinking about something that happened to me on a Sunday not too long ago. It was probably a couple of years ago now, but I had just gotten done. We had just gotten done speaking, and I was stepping down off the platform, and a young millennial approached me. She was probably in their late 20s, and I'd never seen her before. She said, "Hi, my name is so and so. Nice to meet you." She said, "I'm visiting today. I was visiting town or something. Came to the service, and I was like, glad to meet her and so forth. And then, but what she really wanted to talk to me about was that she said, I noticed that you're drinking water out of a plastic bottle. I had whatever those bottles of water, and
bought from Costco or something.
that I'd gotten out of the fridge somewhere. And at first I was like, wait, is that And that's what she wanted to ask me about. She wanted to know, did I realize how that contributed to the contamination, the plastics in the ocean and stuff like that? Which is, I get it. But I just realized too, at the same time, listening to her, wow, that again, I don't want to disparage that. It's an important issue. But at that moment, that was not the biggest fish I had to fry, kind of a thing. Like, the pastoring of the local church and missions and so forth. And it's not either or, it's both and. But I think when you're younger, you tend to push things to the front burner that as you get older, you realize are not the front burner issues.
Yeah.
And you kind of, I think you start to, in your 30s, you begin to mature and you prioritize in a different way. And like I said, it's not that they're unimportant, but you prioritize the order and even what your passion looks like about it.
I
and
guess,
sometimes it takes a radical response,
I might be trying to get a sneaky way of having a conversation about the social gospel when I say this honestly. Like maybe we just need to say that I think, in my opinion, there's like you said, within each generation are these strengths and these weaknesses. And I think there's possible a weakness within the millennial and the Gen Z generation. The failing of putting social before gospel in social gospel instead of gospel before social, because we fully believe that the gospel is the answer to our sin problem, but then within that, with our sin and brokenness, comes all the other ills of man fall within that, including waste, right?
Or excess,
excess and waste, and the answers that my generation failed at, that we were definitely on the excess side, we were definitely on the consumer driven side. And so our kids are going to want to correct that and say, hey man, the 80s were crazy or the 90s were crazy. And we need to think about the planet. We need to think about, but I don't want them to make the same mistakes we did and put our agenda in front of the gospel, whatever that was.
Right.
So unfortunately, a lot for my generation, I'd say Gen X did a pretty good job of advancing, just that, name it and claim it consumer Christianity that was in the 80s. It leaked into the church and became, what's the word I'm looking for that brand of Christianity?
The prosperity gospel.
Prosperity gospel. Thank you. Yeah. That I'm afraid my generation really, drove that forward, prosperity gospel.
But again, isn't it interesting? I said earlier that every generation has its wrestling with the sin of the generation issue, right? And so the 70s and 80s in this country were decades of excess, huge amounts of money being made, whether it was oil companies or tech startups or whatever. And so that excess was all over the place. The Miami Vice movies, the Wall Street movies, whatever, and the Hollywood scene. So the excess was there, and I think the church didn't navigate it very well. I think the church, rather than be part of the answer, became part of the problem. And the prosperity gospel is a perfect example of that. So if your faith isn't grounded well, if your faith isn't mature, you are going to, I think, you run the risk of getting caught up in stuff that might be absolute false doctrine or might be a really watered down version of the gospel. So like the social gospel, you still have the gospel, but this idea of human effort has created this imbalance. Liberation theology is a good example in the 1960s and 70s, all over Central America and South America. Like it was a real problem of the inequality and the injustice and dictatorships. But I think again there was this point where it tipped into error, where we kept the trappings of Christianity, but really we're gun-toting revolutionaries that are going to overthrow the government.
Isn't it interesting? Because you look at the first 300 years of the church, and you see what the gospel did and accomplished. And also, after 300 years, a lot of failings and other things happened. But how much it accomplished. And I think what sometimes we try to do is we try to accomplish those things rather than preach the gospel.
And we forget our roots.
Because what the gospel did in the Roman world was completely transformed everything. It changed, not only what happened in the Colosseum, but what happened in the home. It changed the slave trade. It changed so much. but it was but it was the gospel. We want to change all of those things when we got to let the gospel do its job.
Yeah.
And not that those things shouldn't be addressed, because it was Christians who often would address them. Hey, maybe we shouldn't do this. I see in the gospel this, but our culture is doing this. Maybe we should address that. But it always starts with the gospel rather than trying to.
I was listening to you just thinking, isn't it interesting how you can just look at the 5 or so generations that we've just been talking about and just see how there's a lot of things that could divide us, whether it's big hair or fashion or clothing or excess or practices or war or conflicts and how to address it, economics and things like that. But it's crazy how just looking at just these 5 generations of, say, like 60, 70 years, how the Sermon on the Mount speaks to everyone. The Sermon on the Mount is this universal sort of antidote, if you will, or answer to the questions every generation faces. What do we do about violence? What do we do about our enemies? What do we do about excess or whatever? And that's where I just think the beauty of the gospel really lies.
Okay, so within all those generations have been a lot of men and women individually who felt a call on their life. Some of them maybe stood out in particular generations, like a Billy Graham. Stood out.
Oh my gosh.
Some of them stood out as failures in those generations, like a Jimmy Swaggart or a Mark Driscoll, who's kind of navigated both success and failure, I think, with Mars Hill. I don't really know where he's at right now. I think he's pastoring church. I hope. I'm not trying to pick on Mark Driscoll. God bless him. I hope he's doing great. But but there have been these calls of God that have, some of them really changed generations, led generations. Some of them have been really quiet. I think you basically got discipled in a small church from a guy who probably not a lot of people will ever know his name.
Never know his name.
Yeah, but he was a faithful minister of the gospel in a town.
That's so fascinating because you think about it. If you're listening to this, depending on your age or what generation you find yourself, if you're listening, you can look back if you were a believer at that time, and every generation has a prophetic voice, or / prophetic evangelistic voice.
Yeah.
The 80s was Billy Graham. Billy Graham was the friend of, what was it? I think 7 presidents or something like that. He was the nation's pastor, and the guy led an upright. I mean, he never had a moral failure, never had a scandal, not even close. Or you look at the Lauren Cunninghams, who spoke to a whole generation of people to go into missions.
He's the founder of Youth with a Mission, if you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just 2
Bill
days
Bright.
ago.
Bill Bright was also that contemporary with.
Tony Campolo, 91 years old, just passed away day before yesterday. This is like on the 20th or 21st when we're recording this. But I remember listening to Tony Campolo 20 years ago.
Yeah,
and he was in his late 60s, early 70s. And man, that guy, he had this prophetic anointing to challenge people to act like Jesus in a broken world. It was amazing.
Oh,
I mean, I remember being in a meeting with him in Southern California, probably 2,000 or 3,000 people in the room, and it was just, this call to action. So every generation, like I said, struggles with their sin, but I think every generation has this prophetic voice that God's wanting to tap people.
Yeah. Is the call, when we talk about the call within the church, is that just a ministry thing? Is there a special call particular to ministry that you believe that an individual could be called to ministry?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a call. I mean, we talk about vocations, right? I think there is in the realm of ministry, if you use the word ministry like I'm understanding it, like a pastoral ministry.
Yeah, vocational ministry.
Full time. A good friend of ours in the city, Reed Saunders, he's an evangelist, travels all over the world and does crusades in the style of Billy Graham or the style of Luis Palau. He's pursuing this vocational call. I'm going to be an evangelist, a proclaimer of the gospel till the day I die. Some people are called to pastoral ministries. Some people are called to, say, Christian counseling ministries. But I think there is a distinct call. Now, some people are just called to run the company and do the best job they can and honor God with their hands or their heads or something like that. I think everybody needs a call. Some people, I think, are called to a narrow or maybe narrower niche of, hey, I'm called to cross-cultural full-time missions. Yeah.
I was just reading this morning as I was reading the Word in a few different places. One of them said, hey, not many of you should try to teach.
Yeah.
It's honestly kind of narrowing that call and saying, hey, don't everyone just think you're a teacher. Yeah. Only be a teacher if you're called to teach.
Greater accountability.
If you're a teacher, you're going to have a greater judgment, a greater accountability in the end.
Be careful. Yeah. And I think the call is something, honestly, that we're sort of missing in a way. I I remember at a missions conference, a guy, and well, Keith Green's another great example. Most people wouldn't even know who he was, but he had a huge influence in the 1980s. I think he died in 1982 in this horrific air crash. But he said if we should stop asking whether we're called to go and ask God if we're called to stay.
Yeah.
So he flipped this idea on its head that the call was only for really special, really deep spiritual people. But I think we all should be asking the question, God, you designed me, you created me a certain way. So what does that look like? What is that, the outworking of my design?
Yeah, he was specifically describing missions, saying the Great Commission is for everyone.
Yeah.
So everyone should obey it unless you feel called to stay in this place and do this or that.
But even that's a call.
Right. Yeah.
So it's this this, what do you call it, paradigm. It's this paradigm of I see myself as a servant of Jesus Christ in the kingdom. So where do my gifts and where do my giftings and so forth, where do they lie? How can I make the best use?
I don't know who said this first. It might have been Jim Elliot. It might have been somebody else, but they were describing we're called to go. I don't know if we're called to return.
Yeah.
Because there's this sense of coming and going and comfort, like I'll go serve a season, but is calling for a season. I think there can be seasonal callings, but a call of God in our life is not to be repented of.
You think about the context that we're describing here. We're in our context, we're in North America. Well, I also believe there's other calls. There's secular calls. The siren song of let's just make a bunch of money.
Yeah,
hey,
that's a call.
At the funeral on Saturday for Alex Zukowski, when his son Paul said something that Alex used to say all the time: make sure your ladder is leaning up against the right wall. And so we climb these ladders of success because we feel like, oh, that's the call. I'm going to be famous. I'm going to be wealthy. I'm going to be powerful. And you realize this is bankrupt. This call that I think was significant ends up at the end to be bankrupt. So the call for the believer is tied to the words of Jesus. Well done, good and faithful.
Yeah,
servant.
I think fame would be like you just described a little bit, but I think for this generation, there's been this paradigm shift where you ask a lot of young people what they want to be, and they'll just say famous. Just that's what I want to be. Well, famous for what? I just want to be famous. I want to be known. I want to, because it feels significant. I want my life to matter, and that's what they've seen. Mirrored to them. If you want your life to matter, this is how it matters. This many clicks, this many views, this much attention given to you means that your life matters. But I think
But that is such a hollow promise. It's just such a bankrupt promise.
Yeah. And it's funny how it doesn't matter how many times we interview famous people and they describe that to us, we still don't believe them.
Yeah.
And they'll tell us over and over again how lonely it is, how painful it is.
Dysfunctional.
Yeah, how many of them walk away from it or it destroys them, and we still don't believe them, and we still hunger and thirst for it.
Well, it's the age-old bait and switch, isn't it? You shall be like the Most High.
Yeah.
The fruit of the tree was pleasing to the eye, desirable to make one wise. And so that sort of tactic has just been rehashed for every generation. There's this promise of this is going to make you wise, this is going to make you somebody, but it never delivers.
So what about those young people who are at the first steps of, you're in middle school even or high school or college and you're trying to figure out who you are and what you're designed for. And you're also, if you're a believer, maybe asking God for what is my call? What is my calling? What do I put my hand to? And how do I serve? And I think in the context of what we do, I'm looking for those young men and women who are called to minister.
Yeah.
Minister to the body of Christ, minister as evangelists, minister as missionaries. I'm so wanting to identify them because I'm at that bridge age, like my generation. Okay, I see it. I see everything. I see it behind me and I see it in front of me, how it's happened, in the previous generations, and I see how it needs to happen in the coming generations. And I think when I was a kid, I grew up within a Christian church and did all the Christian stuff. Youth group. I mean, very small youth group because it's a very small town, but camping, ministries, all those things. And ministers would talk to us about some of you are called to ministry.
Right.
And there was this sense of being able to ask, well, God, is that me? Is that who I am? And then hearing a little bit of something in my heart saying, Jason, I want you to move towards this. Right. But feeling so completely inadequate to it. Well, I don't know nothing. I'm afraid to speak to people or I'm this or that. Is there anything to say to those young people that they feel like they might be having a call on their life, but what now? What if they don't feel qualified? What does that mean?
Just sitting there listening, thinking about that thing of the call. I mean, I think it's that idea starts with this question of God, why am I on this planet? And what am I here for? And I think as you begin to say yes to that, I just believe you come into this alignment with the God of the universe. Now, I don't think everybody's called to church ministries. I think that is I mentioned earlier, a prophetic voice to a generation. I think what we are called, what we're trying to do here in Salem, little old Salem, Oregon, just one city out of thousands, is we want to be a pastoral voice to the city and to this generation. We want to be a prophetic voice to this city and to this generation. So that might mean a lot of things. It might mean teaching the gospel on Sunday mornings. It might mean meeting with a married couple midweek.
Performing a memorial service.
Doing memorial services, doing baptisms, counseling. But I think that I think it's a big mistake to create a sacred and secular sort of divide there. I so appreciate, who inspires me are people in the city. I could name names right now who are not working in a church, but they're being the church in their businesses, in the Chamber of Commerce, in the hospital downtown, in Salem Hospital, at the bank downtown. They're being the salt and the light, and they're doing their business with integrity and in partnership with Jesus. I just think that's a beautiful...
Behind so many of the great initiatives within our town to, really bring gospel change to our city is a businessman, Dick Withnell.
Yeah.
Right. And he's not a minister.
No.
He's not called to preach. I've heard him speak. He's fine. But he's not called to preach. That's not his thing.
No.
He built a car business is what he did. But he didn't let that be the end-all, be-all. It was a means to a
He leveraged that
Yeah.
business and his expertise in finances to a greater good. And I think that's it. I think, God, what have I been given? Some of us have been given a lot, the parable of the talents. Some of us have been given incredible opportunity. We've inherited stuff. We are given platforms that no one else has.
Right.
I just think of the believers who are in our government, our local government, whether it's a state senate or whether it's a board of commissioners. And when you get around these people, you realize they have influence, man.
Right. Yeah.
These guys, our board of commissioners in this city, they have influence in our city. Yeah. And I know a few of them, and they're just they love the Lord.
Yeah.
But they're going to do a job that they kind of have been trained or called to do, which is seek the good of the city.
Yeah, I think about Abraham. He was the original call,
Yeah.
right? He had this call on his life to just go somewhere. And there wasn't, I would say to a young person, like, read the passage in Genesis 12 and see how much he understood before he moved. He didn't understand anything. He wasn't given any explanations. He was just told to go somewhere, and he did it.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of conversation along the way, and him having a conversation with God. But the call wasn't really even about him. We don't know that he stood out amongst the others, really, only that he was called.
Yeah.
And that, we sometimes say this phrase, I remember hearing it when I was young and called to missions, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called.
Yeah.
That means there's a power within the call. The call itself brings something to you, which is very unlike anything else. If I needed a plumber a couple weeks ago, I ended up tackling it myself, and I think I've accomplished solving the problem. But I couldn't just pick up a phone when I need a plumber and just call a random number and say, well, you're called.
Yeah, right.
You're called to come to my house, and because you're called, you're qualified to fix my plumbing. No, I'd have to find someone qualified, right?
Who'd gotten prepared.
Yeah, like, well, what are the Yelp reviews on this guy? Who knows how to do this? Now I'm going to get this guy to come and fix my stuff. But the gospel is very different than that. It doesn't do that. It takes the unqualified, really, who are sinful and broken and in need of redemption, and it puts a call on our life. And then that call qualifies us to do the thing that he... And there's training, there's discipleship, there's so much around that.
Yeah, there's having something to offer. You look at the realm of missions, for example. I mean, to get into some of the hardest countries in the world, the most unreached countries in the world, you just can't be a nice person that loves Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
That's a wonderful thing, of course. But you're going to get into that country because you've prepared yourself in some way, following your call. But you've said, I'm going to have a skill that when I get there will open doors for me, or will impact people for the good.
Yeah.
We've got friends that are in unreached countries that have prepared themselves in the area, say agriculture or medicine or something like that, and or business. And when they get there, that skill or that toolbox opens a door for them that the average person couldn't get through.
Yeah. I wonder, I pray because of the place that I'm in of bridging generations. I pray for those younger generations. That we find those young men and women who are, and we're even actively trying to identify them. Like who are the future elders?
Yeah.
We have this conversation all the time.
Yeah.
Who are the millennials right now that are having kids that maybe right now they're a little on the young side, but they're building faithfulness in their life.
Yeah.
They're doing it well. That then a few years from now we'll be able to say, hey, will you come be on the elder team with us? Like we've seen a consistent faithfulness within your life, and looking for those young people who have their Bible open, and are studying and are preparing, and like maybe they don't even know why. Maybe they just have this hunger and thirst for the Word of God. But you're like, there might be a Bible teacher in you, because the first step is into the Bible in you, But trying to find those Bible teachers and identify them.
Yeah. Can I do one minor rant before we finish on this that has come to my mind while you've been talking? I think every generation, again, has its challenges. I think the culture presents some of those challenges, but then I think there's personal. Is the gospel mine?
Right.
So I wasn't raised in church, so to speak, like maybe you were. Your history is different. So the gospel, I'm the first generation born again believer in my family, my sister and I. And I'm very aware that every generation, that old saying, there are no grandkids in the kingdom.
Right.
Every generation, has to have its own personal relationship and the sense of that call. But I think the challenge to every generation is, like every generation, is cynicism, pessimism, passivity, criticism. Yeah. And I just think around us today, we're seeing this really clearly, that there's a whole bunch of kids who were raised in church that have walked away. There's studies and the Barna Group and all these guys, they call them nuns or disengaged or whatever. And they've deconstructed the faith.
Right.
But they have enough of the gospel in them to know what should and shouldn't be. But the danger is they just sit back and point out what's wrong. And the ability to see what's wrong is a cheap and common gift. Where others they see what's wrong, but they say, I'm called to do something about it.
Yeah.
And I think that distinction is, man, whoever you are out there is so clear right now. I think there's a group of people that have just sort of moved into this passive, critical, and they just sit back and have endless conversations about what's wrong with the church. Listen, there's all kinds of things wrong with, just like in every generation, because the church is full of people. Nothing wrong with the gospel. They even hold on to vestiges of the gospel. But man, I'm looking for those 30-somethings that say, I see what's wrong, but I'm going to be part of the answer. Man, I think that's that prophetic voice.
We both of us have read, I'm going to forget the name of it now, I'm sorry. The Jesus Style of Evangelism? Is that what it's called? No, the Jesus Way of Evangelism? I'll have to find that.
The Jesus Style was Gail Irwin, I believe.
Yeah,
right?
not Gail Irwin.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of, I'm sorry, I'll try to think of it and give it to Ethan so he could put a picture of it up here. But he recognizes in this book that the people Jesus chose were faithful, available, and teachable. Those three things: faithful, available, and teachable. I think what you're describing is someone who has decided, I'm faithful, but these guys aren't, and so I'm not available. Like I won't be available to the ministry because I'm not going to, be this. And what Jesus was looking for was men, women who were faithful, available, and teachable. I think the teachable piece, you can decide, you don't have anything to give me. That generation doesn't have anything to give me, so I'm going to do life on my own. I'm going to do church on my own. I'm not going to listen to the previous generation because of their failings in this or that. And you may even be right about their failings. But that also means, unfortunately, you've become unteachable. You've refused to listen.
Yeah, and then you become, you almost, I don't want to use the word useless, but you become impotent. You don't have any impact in a broken world on a social side or on the Christian side.
Right.
You just become an armchair critic, basically. And that's, to me, that's such a difficult thing for me. It's a grieving thing because you started off well, but disappointment or pessimism sort of, sunk your ship and took you out of the game.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if there's anything, I'm just trying to think, how do we encourage from this podcast, maybe people that are listening, to help us identify the call, recognize the calling on their own life.
I think it has to start with this idea that my life is not my own.
Yeah.
That's a very, like Paul, the Apostle Paul said, listen, my life is nothing to me, as he was headed towards Jerusalem to fulfill the call of God on his life.
Yeah.
And his call, he knew, was going to end in a premature death. It was going to end in a Roman prison cell. But that idea that my life is not my own, if you don't start there, I heard a missionary guy say once, if you can talk somebody into it, someone else can talk them out of it. So I have to be convinced by God that my life doesn't belong to me, and then go from there. I think that's that starting point of we call it maybe lordship or surrender or any number of things, but it's this idea that, hey, I've been given a gift of life. I have no idea. Our good friend Alex Zukowski, who we just basically buried a week ago, he died in his early 60s, premature in an accident, right? But he had this sense of surrender that I don't need to do another altar call. I don't need to do another camp. My life is not my own. I'm living for Jesus. And he wasn't a vocational minister, but he ministered the gospel by the evidence of the number of people that showed up and shared how his life had impacted them. He ministered the gospel. So it has to start with my life is not my own. And then what do I do? Where do I go from there?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I in one of these podcasts not that long ago, I had Grace on here, and she was talking about that struggle when she was a kid of lordship and, finally coming to the place where, God, I'll say yes to whatever you say yes to. And that's a struggle. That's what we were talking about earlier with Abraham. He had to move to this place of, if God's a yes, then I'm a yes. If God's a no, then I'm a no.
Yeah.
In other words, God has the right to my life. So.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. I'm really thankful for our church and the way I see generational ministry, from seniors to all the way down to kids ministry.
Yeah.
I think
I'm grateful for every generation has a hope, and hope is what keeps us alive. Hope is what keeps us connected to the kingdom. So.
Yeah, folks, thanks for spending this time with us and exploring the idea of calling together with generations. If you're feeling a call on your life and you need to talk to somebody about that, what that looks like and what it might mean, we would love to have that conversation with you. So, give us a call at Church on the Hill.
Regardless of where you find yourself.
Yeah.
Geographically, financially, whatever season you're in, I believe God calls people that are just willing, like you said.
Absolutely.
Teachable. What is it? The three?
Oh, yeah. It's faithful, available, and teachable.
Yeah.
Faithful, available, teachable.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I would just maybe do a shout out right now to Virginia Wilcox, who I've worked with for many years. She's older than me. She's older than you. She's leaving the U.S. She's been a missionary in the past, but she's leaving the U.S. for a mission field, well into her 70s, and she plans on ending her life there, of just spending the rest of her life on the mission field.
Yeah.
Virginia Wilcox, we'll be praying for her next week from the YWAM base as she gets ready to leave. I don't think I can tell where she's going. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to tell or not where she's going, but she's going to spend her life for Jesus, and it's not because she's 18 years old and excited about what's next. It's because Jesus is the Lord of her life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to finish well.
Yep.
We don't want to stumble 10 yards short of the finish line.
Yeah.
We want to finish well.
Yeah. All right. Bless you guys. Like I said, if you could use prayer or a conversation around this, give us a call, and we'll see you on Sunday.
Yep.